Welcome to our series on Introduction to Brush Lettering. This is the first video in the series that we will be going over our brush lettering guidebook. So this is available for purchase on our Etsy shop. You can get the physical version that we'll send to you with some brush pens. You can also get an instant digital download through our Etsy shop and just print it off at home. So today we'll be going over the basics of brush lettering. We'll talk about the pens and the basic strokes so that we can get you started. The next few videos will be going over the alphabet, variations on your style, and other tips and tricks to get you started. So let's jump in. So what makes brush lettering different from handwriting? The big thing is the contrast between thick and thin strokes. So here's an example. That's handwriting. Hand lettering, which in this case is brush lettering because we're using brush pen, has thick and thin strokes. So you can see here, this part of the letter is a lot more thick than that thin stroke. And that is the first key to hand lettering, the difference between thick and thin strokes. So how do you create a thick stroke versus a thin stroke? Well, first of all, let's talk about the brush pen. So this brush pen is two-sided. The first side that I wrote handwriting in is just like a regular marker. You can only do one thickness. The other side has a flexible tip. So if you were to write lightly on your page, you would see that you get some nice thin strokes. If you apply some pressure, you get thick strokes. So that's the key to what brush lettering is. It's the thicks and the thins. So this page gets you started on practicing thick and thin strokes. You can see these diagrams here. For thick strokes, you'll want to make sure that your pen is a little bit more angled, like parallel to the paper. So of course it won't be exactly parallel, but it'll be close. And you'll use really heavy pressure. The main thing you want to know for thick strokes, I mean, it's pretty easy to create a thick stroke. But the key is that you'll always be doing them on your down strokes. So starting at the top and going down. Okay? Your thin strokes will go from the bottom upwards, from the bottom to the top. So my pen is a little bit more upright or perpendicular to the paper when you're doing your thin strokes rather than your thick strokes, having your pen a little bit more flat. So thin strokes are up, you'll have less pressure, and your pen will be more upright to the paper. You'll notice that we're doing these lines on a bit of an angle, so we're not going straight up and down. That's what that would look like. There is an angle to your baseline, and that'll become more important later on when we start talking about the letters, but just as you're doing this, you'll want to think about the angle. Okay, so these few lines will just help you practice getting the hang of thick down strokes, thin up strokes, thick down using full pressure, thin up. So I would encourage you to continue practicing these. You can go over this as many times as you need or use a blank sheet of paper to practice getting thick and thin strokes that are consistent. You can combine them then. And another key to brush lettering is you will lift your pen between the strokes to make it easier to show the contrast between the thick and the thin. So even though these lines are connected, it's different from cursive where your pen never leaves the paper. You'll be lifting between the strokes in order to keep them consistent and really show the contrast between the thick and the thin strokes. Okay, so if you were to remember 3 things about this page, it would be thick strokes, use full pressure, and always start from the top and go down. So that's number 1, is thick strokes are down strokes. Thin strokes are up strokes that use less pressure, and you'll be writing on an angle rather than straight up and down. Okay? So now we can talk about our basic strokes. So there are 7 basic strokes that make up, for the most part, your lowercase alphabet. Now there are a couple letters that have some strokes that aren't necessarily in these 7. For example, a lowercase k has a stroke that only is in a K, but otherwise these 7 are what you'll need to know. Okay, so you can see this legend I have here, which we used on the previous page as well. Your star is where you'll want to start your pen. A reminder here that thin strokes or upstrokes are thin and downstrokes are thick. So stroke number 1 for basic strokes is an entrance stroke or an exit stroke. It's thin and it starts at the bottom and goes up like that. So it's just a curve up that kind of follows the angle we were talking about. Okay. Number 2 is an underturn. So it's basically a U, and since it starts at the top and goes down, it'll be thick here and thin going back up. Thick, thin. An overturn is next, and that's basically an upside down underturn. So since you're starting at the bottom and going up, it's thin and then thick. So you can either do what I talked about before with lifting your pen between the strokes. If you go up thin, lift, and then transition down into a thick stroke. With these underturn and overturns, you will see that there's a bit, since it's curved at the bottom, you do need to transition between a thick and a thin. It's not just a thick with a thin, like there's no sharp edges here. So just be thinking about transitioning between thin upstroke and gradually add more pressure to make it thick, take off your pressure, and go back up in a thin stroke. So this compound curve, number 4, starts off as an overturn, and right about in the middle, it turns into an underturn. Basic stroke number 5 is an oval. You can either start at the top, transition down into a thick stroke, and then back up into a thin stroke, or you can start over here at 2 o'clock, go down and back up, as long as you keep the down piece of it thick. Okay, next is the ascending stem loop. So this is what you would use for like an H or a K or an L, where it's taller than your X height. So it starts at the top of your X height, which is known as the waistline, and goes up to the ascender line. So since we're going up, it's thin, transition down into a thick stroke. Starts at the waistline, goes up to the ascender, comes back down thick to the baseline. And finally, number 7 is your descending stem loop. So we'll start, this is your X height right here. We'll start at the waistline, down thick to the descender, and come back up thin. Okay, so these are your 7 basic strokes. I'd recommend practicing them until you get a hang of them. Make sure you're always thinking down is thick, up is thin, and it's really about consistency. Okay, so let's just recap what we've learned so far, what the basics are for brush lettering. Again, thicks and thins are the key to making it hand lettering or brush lettering. Using full pressure for your down thick strokes, lighter pressure and a more perpendicular pen for your thin up strokes. We also learned about our 7 basic strokes. So just to give you a little glimpse into our next lesson, the 7 basic strokes make up your lowercase letters. So as an example, if you had an entrance stroke plus an ascending stem loop plus a compound curve, that would give you a lowercase h. So that's what we'll be going over in our next video. We'll start with A and go all the way through the alphabet, looking at our basic strokes and how they form letters. So reach out to us if you have any questions so far. Otherwise, we will see you in our next lesson.